Walter was just an ordinary guy who lived an ordinary life as a dock worker, but one day, out of nowhere, his life changed forever. A group of eagles had chosen Walter and surrounded him wherever he went. But why? Walter had to figure that out. Was there something sinister about the eagles' behavior? As flattered as Walter was by the eagles choosing him, he was also very confused. Eagles typically stayed away from humans and could sometimes even attack them, so why were these eagles so nice to him? And why did he feel like they even trusted him? There had to be something else going on. Walter felt it was his responsibility to figure out what had caused the sudden change in the eagles' behavior. They came to his work every day to be fed, and they recognized Walter out of all the people working on the dock. But Walter was in for a big surprise. Walter decided to do something no one had ever done before with wild eagles. They had very sharp beaks and strong wings. He could get hurt with only one wrong move, but he knew this was the only way to figure out what was really going on. But why were the eagles so obsessed with Walter? Was there really a reason for it? And what would Walter do about it? Walter grew up in a small coastal village surrounded by lush greenery and wildlife. As a child, he was always fascinated by nature and animals. He would spend hours exploring the countryside, observing the various species of birds and other wildlife that lived there. He had a special connection with birds. Their freedom and grace always inspired him. Despite his love for nature, Walter's family did not share his passion. Instead, they encouraged him to pursue a more practical career, so he trained to become a dock worker. He worked hard and was eventually promoted to the position of foreman, responsible for overseeing the departure and arrival of ships. Despite his busy schedule, Walter never lost his love for nature. He would often take breaks from his duties to observe the local wildlife and enjoy the peace and beauty of the coast. He was known for his kind and gentle nature and had a soft spot for animals, especially birds. One day, as he was performing his duties, Walter spotted an eagle perched on the edge of the dock. It was an unusual sight, as eagles typically avoid human contact, so it came as no surprise that Walter was instantly intrigued. This was the moment that would change his life forever. He decided to approach the bird and offer it some food. The eagle was initially wary, but it soon realized that Walter meant no harm. It cautiously took the piece of meat from his hand and ate it. After it finished the meat, the eagle flew away. Walter was glad he helped the hungry bird and didn't think much of it after that. The next day, Walter arrived at the dock to find the eagle waiting for him. It had returned for more food, and Walter was thrilled. He fed the bird again and spent some time observing its behavior. He was fascinated by the way the eagle moved and how it seemed to trust him. Walter never imagined that he would form a bond with a wild animal. This was all he could have ever dreamed of. But he wondered why the eagle would act like this. Was it able to hunt by itself? Maybe its habitat was in danger, and it wanted Walter to help. Walter went home that day with many questions going through his head. He was glad the eagle confided in him, but he worried it wouldn't survive in the wild anymore. The next day, he returned to the dock expecting to see the eagle patiently waiting for him. But to his surprise, the eagle wasn't there anymore. Walter couldn't help but feel disappointed. He wished his time with the eagle had been longer, but there was nothing he could do about it, so he continued with his work for the day. Then, around noon, when Walter was about to go on his lunch break, he heard a familiar sound from above. The eagle had returned, but it wasn't alone. This time, a whole group of eagles landed on the dock and looked at Walter with hopeful eyes. Walter was taken aback by the eagle's trust in him. The eagle had gathered its friends and brought them to him. This meant the world to Walter. Walter was moved by the eagles, so he headed inside and quickly got some meat out of the freezer. He had stored a few cubes of raw meat there in case the eagle returned, but it wasn't enough for all the eagles. So he quickly headed to the store and bought more. When he came back, Walter noticed many people had gathered around the eagles. It was just as special for them as it was for Walter. But Walter wasn't happy with all the commotion. He feared the eagles would get scared by the other humans and fly away, never returning to Walter. So Walter did something he wasn't proud of. He told the bystanders the eagles were his trained pets and that they were very sick. Even though it wasn't Walter's proudest moment, his plan worked. Some people got scared and kept more distance between themselves and the birds, and others even left. Walter was finally alone again with the eagles, but his break was almost over. He fed them quickly and expected them to fly away, but they stayed. This confused Walter, but he had no time to dwell on it. He quickly got back to his job, but throughout the day, something extraordinary happened. As Walter proceeded with his duties, he expected the eagles to fly away eventually, but the eagles stayed put and kept a close eye on Walter the whole time. If he went inside a ship, for example, he would come outside and see the eagles had walked over to that same ship. They were following him. Walter felt very special because of the eagles' behavior, but he couldn't shake the confusing feeling about why the eagles were behaving this way. He had to figure out what was going on with them and possibly help them if needed. And he knew just the way, but it wasn't an easy way. For his plan to work, Walter needed a very small camera, and he had to catch an eagle or get one of them to trust him so he could put the camera around its claw. So after work, Walter went back to the store and bought as much raw meat as he could. Then he carefully laid all the meat in a little pile in front of him and waited. He sat very still, and slowly the eagles walked his way and began eating the meat. They had very sharp beaks and claws and could easily hurt Walter, so he had to be very careful. He chose one of the eagles, the one who stood closest to him, and carefully tied the camera around its claw. Walter's heart was beating in his chest, but he managed to succeed. Then he slowly stepped back and connected the camera to his phone to see if it worked, and to his excitement, it did. When the eagles finished their second meal of the day, they flew away with their bellies filled. Walter felt very pleased with his plan. On the camera footage, he could see where the eagles were going after they ate and maybe discover what had happened to their habitat, that they couldn't hunt for themselves anymore. That evening, Walter sat behind his laptop and watched Liv what the eagles were doing. They were still flying, so it seemed like they had come from very far. The camera Walter had bought also came with a GPS tracker, so he knew exactly where they were. But when he looked at the tracker, he was shocked the eagles were flying in circles above Walter's home. He hadn't realized it yet, but when he looked at the tracker, he suddenly saw his own address. So he ran outside to see if it was true, and it was. When they noticed Walter, they dove down and landed in his backyard. Walter was stunned. How was it possible that these eagles knew where he lived? He was very sure that they had not followed him on his way home, as he would have seen them if that was the case. He knew these animals were great hunters, but this should have been impossible. Walter was now faced with a big dilemma. How was he going to deal with this very strange situation? He could simply call animal control and let them deal with it, but he had no idea what they would end up doing with the animals. And on top of that, this would not answer any of his questions. He was now even less sure that the eagles were following him just because he was feeding them. If that were the case, they would most likely just wait for him at the docks, as that was where he was always feeding them. There had to be something else going on here. At the dock, Walter's boss had had enough of the eagles constantly being in the way and disrupting the busy workflow. Walter was given an ultimatum: make sure the eagles left or be fired on the spot. The eagles had to go, one way or another. Walter was saddened by this. He had bonded with the animals, and this likely meant he would never find out why they had been so drawn to him in the first place. But a part of him also felt some relief. The next day, Walter brought his pistol and asked his colleagues to bring theirs as well, to help get rid of the eagles. The boss made an exception to the company's no firearms policy. With a heavy heart, Walter and his coworkers aimed their guns in the air and started firing blanks. From the moment the first shot rang out, the eagles were completely shaken. They couldn't get away fast enough. Walter was sure they were so scared that they would probably never return. What his boss didn't know, though, was that Walter still had the tracker in place. When Walter got home that evening, the eagles were not there. The scare tactic had worked wonders, but all Walter could think about was where they had gone. So the first thing he did was fire up the tracker again. To his surprise, the eagles weren't far away. The tracker pointed to a small house, only about a 15-minute drive from his location. Were the eagles now bothering someone else after he scared them away? Walter knew he should have left the animals alone, but his curiosity got the better of him. He had spent too much time with them to forget about them now that they were out of sight. Walter got into his car and drove to the address where the tracker was located. When he arrived at the very ordinary-looking house, he saw the eagles scattered all over the property. Who was living here that could attract the eagles in the same way he had? Walter nervously rang the doorbell. A woman about his age opened the door, and when she saw his face, her eyes went wide. She stammered that this couldn't be true and nearly passed out. Walter barely managed to catch her. Once she recovered, she gave Walter the explanation he had been desperate for. Apparently, the eagles had first bonded with her late husband, Danny. He had fed the birds daily for nearly a year, and they had always been around their house and his work. Sadly, Danny had passed away about 2 weeks ago. The eagles had loyally stayed at the house for a while, even though Danny's wife had stopped feeding them, preoccupied with her grief. Then, one day, the eagles disappeared. One of them must have spotted Walter, and the rest followed. The woman explained that when she first saw Walter, she thought her husband had come back to life because Walter was the spitting image of Danny. After she recovered from the shock, she told Walter that she was happy to have the birds back at her house. She had missed their company and was planning to feed them daily again so they would stay. Walter still occasionally visits to see the birds.